was a tunnel wide enough for a forklift, wired with industrial lighting and still warm from the last convoy that had passed through it. Stacked floor to ceiling, vacuum-sealed bricks, military-grade weapons, and 7 duffel bags that would later weigh in at $19 million in cash. But the thing that stopped every agent in their tracks wasn't the drugs. It was the laminated map pinned to the tunnel wall. On it, transit routes, patrol shift windows, and a name no one expected to see. This moment ended a 16-month investigation. Here's how it started.
Would become the most reviled name in Illinois law enforcement history.
Stood ready to defend their operation
437 students trapped.
3:14 a.m.
Deceased.
Chicago, Illinois. South Side Industrial Corridor, 2 miles from Lake Michigan. FBI Special Operations, DIA Tactical Intelligence, and ICE strike teams are sitting in unmarked vehicles in the dark,
in India, Pakistan,
waiting.
Nigeria, Brazil,
Nobody is
Vietnam,
speaking,
and 11 other countries,
because what they've intercepted over the last 48 hours has changed the nature of this operation entirely. What started as a narcotics distribution probe has turned into something federal command is calling, quietly, in encrypted memos, the most sophisticated urban cartel infrastructure ever discovered on American soil. 9.2 tons of fentanyl, $19 million in untraceable cash, and a tunnel network beneath the South Side that nobody, not Chicago PD, not the DIA field office, not even city infrastructure engineers, knew existed. 3 questions are burning through every agent on that task force tonight. How long has this been running? Who gave the cartel access to city subsurface maps? And the one that nobody wants to say out loud, how many people inside the system helped build this? Keep watching.
Stay with this.
Because those answers come,
what they found beneath
and none of them are comfortable.
Far darker than
4:03 a.m. 6 breach teams moved simultaneously across 4 Chicago zip codes. Flashbangs cracked the silence above a South Side auto parts warehouse. Doors come off hinges. Agents in tactical gear pour through like water. Inside, a processing operation mid-shift. Workers scattering. One man sprinting for a back exit with a laptop bag that federal analysts will spend 9 hours cracking. At a second location, a freight logistics company on the southwest side, agents find 3 semi-trucks loaded with legitimate agricultural cargo on top, and 900 kilograms of cocaine sealed in modified floor compartments underneath. A third team hits a cartel stash house in Cicero. 2 armed guards. A false wall. Behind it, 47 military-grade assault rifles, 12 of them with serial numbers traced to a law enforcement evidence lockup that had reported them destroyed 2 years ago. And what they find in the first 10 minutes of that raid? Keep watching. It's the tunnel entrance, hidden beneath a hydraulic lift in the auto parts warehouse floor. And once agents descend, they realize this isn't a passage. It's an artery, stretching nearly a mile in 2 directions, reinforced with steel framing, ventilated and equipped with a narrow-gauge rail system for moving products. Along the walls, 14 separate storage alcoves, each climate-controlled, each packed. 2.4 tons of fentanyl pills, 3.1 tons of methamphetamine,
near the entrance that read,
heroin,
polished bronze lettering,
cocaine,
the architecture of tomorrow.
and those 7 cash-filled duffel bags. The total seizure across all locations that morning, 9.2 tons of narcotics and $19 million. But the laminated map on the tunnel wall, with patrol routes, shift change windows, and that name, that becomes the center of everything. If you think this is big, the next discovery is going to stop you cold. Stay with me.
Foreign nationals appear
6 hours later.
Database to be actively enrolled students in
FBI Cyber Command has the seized hard drive. Quantico is online. Analysts begin peeling back the encryption layer by layer, and what appears on those screens is not a drug network. It's an architecture. They're calling it internally Operation Iron Corridor. Shell companies, 17 of them, registered across Illinois, Indiana, and Wisconsin. Ghost accounts funneling cartel revenue through a regional restaurant chain, 2 construction firms,
Continental
and a
University.
nonprofit that filed for a federal infrastructure grant 8 months ago.
The human logistics
The money
coordinator
moves
for a
fast
network
and
that has been
clean.
moving foreign
Cartel
nationals into
distribution
and through
revenue
the
to
United
shell
States
accounts.
under fraudulent
Shell
student
accounts
visa
to
cover
legitimate
for 7
business
years.
revenue to political donation networks,
At
and in
4:13
2
a.m.,
documented
all 3
cases
teams
directly
moved
to campaign
simultaneously.
financing.
The breach at the South Michigan Avenue
The man
building
at the
was
center of this
controlled and
digital
totaled.
map is Miguel
FBI
Salazar,
tactical
known in
units
cartel
supported by
communications
ICE
only as
enforcement
El
and removal
Arquitecto.
operations teams and a DH civil rights
The
enforcement
Architect.
detachment
Tunnel
entered through the
operations
building's
chief
main
for the
access
Sinaloa
points at
Cartel's
exactly the
Chicago
same moment.
distribution network. A man who has never
The
been
overnight
arrested,
security, 2 personnel,
never photographed
both
at a
of whom
scene,
cooperated immediately,
and whose name
were
appears on
detained
zero
and
law
interviewed
enforcement
on-site. The
databases.
building's internal network
Until
was
now.
isolated using a signal disruption
One
protocol
analyst,
that prevented
12
remote
years with
file
the Bureau,
deletion across
sits
all
back from her
connected
screen
systems,
and calls her
floor by
supervisor.
floor, room by room.
Her hands are shaking.
Agents moved through the building
She's found the
with systematic
subsurface
precision of
access
people who had
permits,
studied its
city
floor
issued,
plans for months.
legitimate, and
On the
signed
3rd
off
floor,
through a municipal
the International
infrastructure
Student
office.
Services Department.
Someone with
Agents
city
found
access
3
had
staff
approved
members
construction
working an
work in
overnight
those
shift.
corridors 18 months ago. The permits listed a fictional drainage upgrade
Document
project.
processing,
And
enrollment
among the seized
verification
phones,
letters
one
being
contains a
generated by the
text
dozen,
thread with someone
printed,
inside that
signed
office.
with a facsimile
That
stamp,
open loop,
and prepared
it's
for
about
mailing
to close
consular
in the
offices
worst way
across 12
possible.
countries.
But El Arquitecto
The
wasn't
printers were
working
still
alone.
running when agents
The
entered
tunnel
room.
system had a silent
The
partner.
agents let them finish.
Someone with the kind of
printed
access that
documents were
doesn't
bagged
come
as
from
evidence.
money.
On the 5th
It
floor,
comes from
the
a badge.
administrative core of the
5:23
operation,
a.m.
agents found something that no legitimate university
Joint
had
Task
any
Force
reason to
Command
contain.
Center, downtown
A
Chicago.
dedicated
The digital
immigration
map on the
document
wall has
fabrication
43
laboratory,
red
12
markers
workstations
pulsing
running
across the
custom-designed
metro area.
service record management
1,200
software.
federal
Modified
agents.
federal forensic analysts
58
would later
SWAT
confirm
teams.
to allow the direct alteration
16
of official
Black
federal
Hawk
immigration
helicopters,
database
DIA
entries
tactical
in
units
ways that
running
should have been
parallel operations
architecturally
along the
impossible
I-90
without
corridor.
internal system.
ICE strike teams working 3 border-connected transit hubs. The scale is unlike anything
Access.
Chicago
4
has seen.
high-capacity document
And in the
production
next
units
4
capable
hours,
of
it
generating
unfolds
50
fast.
complete
A
fraudulent
desert-adjacent
student packages
super
per
lab
hour.
outside Gary, Indiana,
physical filing
producing an
system containing
estimated
records on every
400
enrolled
kilograms
student,
of
not
meth
academic
weekly,
records,
is
but
breached
operational
and
records.
shut down. A luxury
file
property in the
noting
northern
student's visa
suburbs,
status, their payment
registered to a
schedule,
shell
their level of
company,
awareness of the
yields
scheme's
3
true
senior
nature,
cartel
and
logistics
in a color-coded
coordinators
system
and a
that
safe
agents
containing
on
property
scene
deeds
described
for
as the
6
most
more
organized
warehouses.
criminal record keeping
A
any
human
of us had
trafficking
ever
transit
seen.
house on
Their
the west
assessed risk
side
of
is raided.
cooperation with.
43
Federal
people
authorities have
rescued.
approached.
Agents don't speak for a
They
long
had
time after
categorized
that
their
room
own
is
victims
cleared.
by
The
the
total
threat they
across the
posed,
full
and in a
operation,
locked cabinet in the office of
361
Dean Aldrich
arrests,
Somerton Payne,
8.4
a
tons of
cabinet that
additional
required a secondary
narcotics,
key that agents found taped
$67
beneath
million
his desk,
in combined
with 4
cash and
sealed
seized
accordion
assets,
folders.
89 firearms. The network looks finished,
Physical
and for
records,
about 40 minutes,
handwritten,
Federal
and a
Command
personal
allows
shorthand
itself to
cipher.
believe it is. That was the false ending,
Financial ledgers,
because then the final server cracks open. Or so
payment,
they thought.
Routing records, and a
What's
series of
inside that
correspondence
server
files
doesn't
whose
describe a
contents,
drug
once
operation.
translated by the
It
FBI
describes a
document
system,
analysis unit,
a second
would
layer
over
so
the following
embedded in
48
Chicago's
hours
infrastructure
completely
that
reframe
dismantling the
scale and
cartel
nature
on
of
its
what
own
federal
doesn't
investigators
touch
thought
it.
they were dealing with.
26 police officers, active
Because
duty,
Midwest
on
Continental
documented monthly
University
cartel
was not the
payroll.
center of this
Payments
operation.
disguised as
It
consulting
was the
fees from one of the
intake
shell
point. By 8
construction
a.m.,
companies.
the physical
9
operations
border
were
and
secured,
transit
and the analytical
officials
phase
whose
had begun.
patrol schedules had been quietly adjusted
In the FBI's
on a rotating
Forensic Analysis
basis
Center at
to
the
open
Bureau's
20 to
Chicago
40
field
minute
office,
windows for
a team
drug
of 12
convoys
analysts,
moving through
financial crime
checkpoints.
specialists,
4 sitting
immigration
judges
fraud
whose case
investigators,
dismissal records, when
and
mapped
2
against
cyber
cartel
forensic
arrest
technicians on loan
timelines,
from the
show a
Bureau's
pattern that
Washington
federal
Cyber Division
prosecutors
had been
describe
given the
as
seized
statistically
document system.
impossible to
The
explain
hard
any
drives
other
from
way.
the Schaumburg
And
Processing
at the
Center
center of that
and the contents
laminated
of
tunnel
Dean
map,
Payne's
the name
accordion
that
folders
stopped
and
every
totals
agent
mapped the
cold,
full architecture.
is a deputy
They found
director
it
within
at
Chicago's
2:17
municipal
p.m.
infrastructure office.
What
The
appeared on
same
the
office
central
that
analysis
signed off
screen
on those
assembled
drainage
from 3
permits.
separate data
The same
sources
office that had
cross-referenced against
subsurface
each other
access to
in a
city
process
tunnel
that the lead
schematics
analyst
going back
later
30
described as
years.
like watching a city appear
This
out of
next
fog
part,
was not a
focus,
simple visa fraud
because this is where it
operation.
becomes
was a
something else
continental
entirely.
infrastructure.
The deputy
A
director had been
self-sustaining,
feeding the Sinaloa
multi-jurisdictional
network
criminal
city
network
infrastructure
that had been
data
using
for
fraudulent
22
American
months.
student visa
Not for
status as the
ideology,
entry mechanism
for money,
for a human
initially.
smuggling and labor exploitation
Then for protection.
pipeline that extended
Because
to
once
foreign
you're in,
recruitment
El
offices in
Arquitecto
South
made
Asia
sure
and
you
West
understood
Africa,
the cost
all
of
the way to
leaving.
labor.
3 federal witnesses from prior investigations had recanted testimony in the last
Trafficking
18
operations in the
months.
agricultural
2
corridors
had
of the
relocated.
American Midwest.
One
They
had
named what
simply
they had
stopped
found
being
immediately.
reachable.
In the
The
case file
cartel
that was
didn't
opened
need
within the
violence to
hour.
control the system.
Project Paper Fortress.
It needed leverage, and it had cultivated it.
The architecture of
Patiently,
Project Paper
methodically,
Fortress was
across
vast
law
and
enforcement,
deliberate.
the judiciary,
41 shell
and municipal
companies and ghost
government the way you'd
corporations
build a
registered across
tunnel.
Delaware, Wyoming,
Slowly.
Illinois, and 5 foreign
Underground.
jurisdictions. each one a layer of the operation's
where no one is
financial
watching.
and logistical infrastructure.
On 22nd,
Fake educational
Miguel Salazar was
consultancy firms
arrested at
operating in
O'Hare
India,
International
Nigeria,
Airport
and
attempting to
Pakistan
board a
that were in
connecting
operational
flight
reality.
under a secondary
Foreign
identity.
recruitment fronts for the
The
Global
deputy
Education
director was
Syndicate,
taken into federal
charging
custody the
families
same
between
morning.
$15,000 and $40,000
26
per
officers
student
faced
for
charges.
guaranteed
The
American
network, by
university
every
placement
visible
and
metric,
then
was
funneling that
dismantled.
recruitment capital through offshore
361
accounts in
arrests,
Cyprus and the United Arab
9.2
Emirates
tons of
before it
fentanyl
arrived.
off Chicago
Clean
streets,
in the accounts of
19
Midwest
million in
Continental
recovered
operating
cash.
entities.
Justice
Sham
on
nonprofit
paper had been
foundations
served,
with names like
but
the Global
investigators
Student
found
Advancement
one
Fund
more
and the
file on that
Cross-Cultural
final
Academic
server,
Excellence
a
Initiative
succession
that had
document,
received charitable
names,
donations
roles,
from
and
well-meaning
operational
technology
assignments
sector
for a
donors
parallel
and
network
used those
already
funds to pay
active
for the
in 3
operations
additional
document
cities.
fabrication.
The architect had designed the system to survive its own exposure.
Infrastructure.
Chicago was not the origin point. It was the prototype. They didn't just
Managing
infiltrate the
apartment
system.
complexes
They
where enrolled
franchised
students
it.
were required
In
to
Illinois
live as a
alone,
condition of their
fentanyl-involved
enrollment.
overdose deaths
rental
reached
rates that were documented in the
2,600 last
operational
year.
records as a
The
secondary
majority of
revenue
the
stream
supply
for the
has now been
syndicate.
traced to distribution
Transportation
chains
logistics
connected to
firm
this
whose
network.
vehicles moved students
43
between
people
housing
rescued from
facilities
that
and the
West Side
off-campus
transit
work study
house.
sites, where many of them had
Investigators
been
believe
placed
more than
not in
200 others
educational
moved through that
internships, but in
same
labor
operation
arrangements,
remain
food processing
unaccounted for.
plants, agricultural
A
facilities,
mother in
and
Pilsen
warehousing
lost her
operations.
19-year-old son to a
Whose connections
fentanyl
to the
pill he
syndicate's
believed was a
financial
painkiller.
network were documented in the
She
seized
found
ledgers.
out 8
The
months
money
later
flows
where
were
it came
global
from.
and
She testified at the federal hearing anyway. That took
Visa
something most
processing
people will
fees
never
charged
be
to
asked to
students upon
find.
arrival.
This is not just a
Monthly
crime
enrollment
story.
maintenance fees
This is a
that students
blueprint.
were required to
It
pay to
happened
keep their
beneath
visa
Chicago.
status active.
It is happening
Fees that
elsewhere.
went not to
And
any
power at
educational
this
function,
level
but
doesn't
directly
announce
into
itself.
syndicate
Flying into
controlled
the
accounts.
It
US
files
from overseas.
permits.
Labor
It
placement
shows
fees
up to
charged
work.
to the employers who
It
received
signs
the students as
documents.
workers. And
And it
beneath all of it,
builds
a secondary
quietly
revenue
until the
stream
tunnel
that
is
the
finished
operational
and the
records
lights
refer to
are
simply
already
as
on. If you
extended
made it
service
this far,
contracts.
you're paying attention in a way that
Category
matters.
when fully
Tap like
translated
so
from
this
the
story
cipher,
reaches
contains
people who
personal
need to hear
ledgers,
it.
referred to the
Comment
exploitation of
expose
students
if
whose
you want
visa
these
status
networks
had been
brought to
deliberately
light.
compromised by the
Share this
syndicate
with someone
itself,
who's been
making
asking
them
the right
undocumented
questions.
and therefore
The 3
unable
other
to
cities in
leave,
that
report
succession
to
file?
authorities,
We're
or
still
seek outside
investigating.
help.
Part 2 drops
They
Friday.
had been
Subscribe.
manufactured into
Because the
victims.
next one goes deeper than this one. And that name at the top of the successor
Deliberately.
list? Nobody saw it coming.
Today, the Drug
Systematically.
Enforcement Administration announced a massive
With
drug
paperwork.
bust connected to a major Mexican cartel.
Some of these
And
shipments
then
were so large
came
they
the
were brought here in
authorization
semi-trucks.
architecture. Every
Seattle
major
woke up to
operational
chaos.
decision
In
within
a
Project
sweeping
Paper
pre-dawn
Fortress,
raid, federal
every new
agents
recruitment
stormed
market
warehouses,
opened, every
ports,
new
and
labor
neighborhoods,
placement arrangement
uncovering a
activated,
Sinaloa
every
cartel
payment
command
above
cell operating
$200,000
inside the city.
authorized
The
required
mission,
a secondary
Operation
approval
Take
from a
Back
credential
America,
identified
was
in
an
the system as
18-month
architect.
joint DEA-ICE offensive that exposed how deeply
Cross-referencing that
cartels had
credential
embedded
against
within
every
U.S.
available
borders.
federal
For
database
Seattle,
took the analytical
it wasn't
team
just a
6
bust.
hours.
It was the
Architect
day
was
the
the operational
fentanyl war
alias of
reached
State
home.
Education
And
Commissioner
Homeland Security
Harlan
officials
Beecroft
say
Graves,
Mexican
a
cartels
fictional
now
public
are
official,
attempting to track,
appointed 4
harass,
years
and
prior
target
to oversee
immigration and
Illinois'
border
private
patrol
academic
agents.
institution
The
licensing
numbers
and
told the story
accreditation
better
framework.
than any headline could.
The
19
very
people
framework
tied
that had
directly
issued
to
Midwest
Mexico's
Continental
Sinaloa
University
cartel
its
faced
operating
37
license. The
federal
very
charges,
framework that had
from
processed
conspiracy
and
to
approved
drug
the
trafficking to
institution's
weapons
application
violations.
for authorization
The
to
arrests
enroll foreign
spanned
students
Seattle,
on F-1
Tacoma,
visas.
and surrounding
The very
counties.
framework that had,
Agents
in 3
seized
consecutive annual
4,000
review cycles,
765
determined that
pounds of
Midwest
methamphetamine,
Continental was in full
269
compliance with
pounds of
all
fentanyl,
applicable state
23
and
pounds of
federal
cocaine,
educational standards.
6.4 pounds of heroin, and a
Graves had
stockpile
not
of
simply
23
approved the
firearms,
operation.
some
He had
modified
designed
for
the
automatic
regulatory
fire
pathway that
and
made it
explosive
impossible to
materials
catch.
recovered
He had
from
used his
hidden
position at
compartments
the apex
inside
of the
suburban
state's
garages.
educational oversight
Each item on
infrastructure
that list
to ensure
represented
that
not
every
just
formal
contraband,
inquiry,
but an
every
industry's
compliance check,
entire
every
infrastructure
accreditation review that
exposed
touched
in one
Midwest
sweep.
Continental was either
Investigators later
managed,
said the
delayed, or
fentanyl
quietly
alone could have
closed
produced
before it could generate a
6.9
federal.
million lethal doses, enough to wipe out the combined populations of Seattle and Tacoma several times over. In total, 51 arrests across the
Referral.
country were linked to the
This
same
was not
supply
bureaucratic
chain,
failure.
showing
This
how
was
deep the
command-level
operation
collusion.
reached.
This was not
Takedown wasn't a
negligence and
single
oversight.
lucky raid.
This was
It was the
engineered
end of an
treason against
18-month
every
pursuit
family that had
across
trusted the
multiple
American
states,
education
tracking
system to
encrypted
be
chats,
exactly what it
tracing
claimed to
wire
be.
transfers,
And Project Paper
decoding a
Fortress
smuggling
had only
network
just
that
been
treated
opened. The
American
next
highways
phase of
like
what the
conveyor
Bureau
belts.
was now calling Operation
The cartel
Empty
behind
Diploma
it wasn't
was
new.
being
It was
authorized
the same
as the
Sinaloa
analysis team
empire
was
that had
still
spent
reading.
decades moving product across
At
borders,
3:45
adapting
a.m.
faster than any government agency could respond. But
Two
the structure
mornings after the
discovered in
initial
Seattle
raids, the
wasn't
lights
an
were
import.
on in the
It was a
FBI's
branch
Joint
office.
Operations
The
Command
network
Center
had
in
found a way
Chicago.
to operate from within, merging
On
local
the central
contacts,
display wall,
legal
a
trademarks,
floor-to-ceiling
and
digital
financial
map
channels
of the continental
into a
United
self-sustaining
States
system.
Red
When
markers
investigators
pulsed
followed
across
the
the
trail,
Midwest
they
and
found two
beyond, 53 of them,
Say this ring
each one a
distributed
confirmed
deadly drugs
node in the
up the
Global
West Coast
Education
to
Syndicate's
Washington.
operational
From
web.
strongholds in Sinaloa,
Each one
the brothers
identified
managed a
through the
pipeline
Project
that
Paper
began in
Fortress
Mexico,
architecture.
ran through California's
Each one
freight
connected
depots, and
by
ended in
documented
Washington's
evidence
ports
to
and
the
warehouse
network that
districts.
Commissioner
They
Graves
didn't
had
cross
spent 4
borders
years
carrying
protecting.
drugs. They controlled the people and logistics that did. Freight forwarders, trucking companies, and customs
53
brokers,
locations,
many of them
9
legitimate
states,
businesses, were
2
folded into
foreign
their plan.
coordination points,
The brothers
and a
communicated through
5-hour
encrypted
strike window
channels,
beginning
routing
at dawn.
messages
The
through
task
dummy
force
accounts
assembled
and
for
foreign
Operation
servers.
Empty Diploma's
Their
second
operations
phase
blending
was
seamlessly
unlike
into
anything
legal
the Bureau's
commerce.
civil rights and
Semi-trucks
immigration
carrying
enforcement
fertilizer
divisions
or
had
household
previously
goods
deployed
also
in a
carried
single
tightly
coordinated
sealed
action.
chemical containers.
Over
Couriers moved
1,050
shipments through the
federal
I-5
agents,
corridor under
FBI
ordinary
civil
shipping
rights enforcement
manifests.
units,
The
ICE enforcement
drugs
and
were stored
removal
in
operations
garages,
teams,
sheds, and rental
DACE
properties
human
scattered
trafficking
between
task force
Everett and Tacoma.
specialists,
Every
Department
step
of
was
Labor
built to
Wage
look
and
normal
our
until
division
the day federal
investigators,
agents moved
and
in.
a State Department
very
consular fraud
significant
enforcement
bust. A
detachment,
very
16
significant
SWAT
operation
teams
for the
assigned to
Pacific
high-risk
Northwest.
entries at
Reeves
known
says
syndicate-controlled
their investigation
properties.
started 2 years
Forensic
ago,
document
with
teams
undercover
pre-positioned
agents
at 12
buying drugs in
primary
Tacoma,
evidence sites.
to their most
Victim
recent bust
services
in early
coordinators,
August,
social
which
workers,
stretched across
interpreters in
11
14
different
languages,
locations in the
trauma
Seattle
specialists,
area. Not
staged
only
at
seizing
secure
Both
processing
brothers ran
facilities in
finances
Chicago,
through
Indianapolis,
cryptocurrency wallets
Detroit,
and
St.
shell
Louis,
companies
and
registered
Milwaukee,
in Delaware
because
and Mexico
federal
City,
investigators
giving them
understood
the
that what they
appearance
were
of
about to
distant
find at
investors
many of these
rather than drug
locations were not
traffickers.
criminal suspects.
The money trail
They were
showed
going to find
deposits in
people who
digital
needed
coins,
help.
later converted to pesos.
At 3:45 a.m. exactly, the assistant director
businesses.
of the FBI
By the
Civil
time
Rights
agents
Division
traced one
gave the
transaction,
authorization.
another had already been cashed
53
out.
markers began
Among
to go
those
dark.
arrested on U.S. soil were key
In
operators.
Chicago's northwest
Isabel Barry
suburbs,
Sapon,
the Schaumburg
44-year-old
Document
truck
Processing
driver,
Center,
was caught
where
moving
fraudulent
multi-hundred-pound
immigration
loads
records
of
had been
meth and
manufactured
fentanyl
around the
between
clock,
state lines.
was entered at
Jose Felix
3:52
German,
a.m.
a
by a
34-year-old
10-agent
Mexican
ICE
citizen
fraud
deported in
unit supported by 2
had
FBI
illegally
forensic
re-entered
teams.
the U.S.
Inside,
to
11
manage
personnel
financial
on the overnight
transactions
shift,
and
all
coordinate
detained.
local redistributors.
14
Each
active
faces a minimum
workstations
of
generating
10 years in
I-20
federal
forms at the
prison,
moment of entry.
and the possibility of life
47,000
sentences under
complete
U.S.
fraudulent
drug and
student
weapon
records
statutes.
stored across the
The
facility's
scope of
server
their network
infrastructure.
reflected a simple truth.
And a physical safe
Sinaloa
containing
didn't just
$1.2
smuggle
million
drugs
in
anymore.
cash,
It built
recruitment
systems that
fees
mirrored
collected in
legitimate
foreign
industry.
currency and converted,
Routes,
representing the
warehouses, and
financial
supply
residue of
chains ran
hundreds
with
of families'
corporate
life
precision,
savings
and
funneled
the
through the
Pacific Northwest
operation's
had
foreign
quietly
intake
become
network.
one of its main
In Rockford,
distribution
Illinois,
hubs.
a food
Seattle
processing
and Tacoma,
facility
with
that had
their
been receiving
dense
student
ports
labor
and steady
placements
freight
from Midwest
traffic
Continental was
provided the
found at
perfect cover for what
4:08 a.m.
investigators called
to contain a locked
logistics-based
rear
infiltration.
administrative office housing
The
records
Sinaloa
on over
cartel
90
peddles this
students
poison
who had
for
been
one
placed there
reason,
as workers,
to make money.
none of whom had consented
this
to labor
case, we hit them
placement as
where
a
it
condition
hurt.
of their
In
enrollment,
Seattle,
and
Behind
all of
the
whom had
criminal
been told by
mechanics
syndicate
lies the
coordinators
crisis
that
that
failure
pushed
to
the
report to
operation
work
to
would
urgency.
result in the cancellation
Washington's
of their
overdose
visa
numbers
status.
told their own version
Department
of a
of
state
Labor
under siege.
investigators on
In
scene described it
2023
as the
alone,
clearest
the state
documented pattern
recorded
of labor coercion through immigration
3,477
status manipulation
overdose
we have processed.
76% tied directly to fentanyl. In King County,
In Peoria,
deaths
a
passed
residential
1,000
facility,
for the
a
first
large
time.
house registered to a
Local
syndicate
officials
shell
described
company
morgues
housing
operating at
23
near
students,
capacity, and
was
first
secured at
responders
4:21
fielding multiple
a.m.
overdose
by an
calls
ICE enforcement
daily.
team, accompanied
Federal
by
lab
victim
data from
services
seized
coordinators.
counterfeit
The
pills
students
confirmed
inside
why.
from India,
5 out
Nigeria,
of 10
and Brazil
pills
were
contained more than
interviewed
2
on site.
milligrams of fentanyl,
None of them were
an amount
suspects.
capable of
All of
killing
them
the
were
average
victims.
adult within minutes.
Several had
And
not
those
left the
pills
facility
weren't
in months,
packaged
their
as street
movements
drugs.
controlled through the
They were
threat of
disguised
visa
as
cancellation.
everyday medications.
All
Adderall
were
for
provided
students,
immediate victim status
oxycodone for pain
documentation
relief,
and consular
Xanax for
notification.
anxiety.
In Indianapolis,
To a
a
parent, they
satellite
looked
syndicate
harmless.
recruitment
To the
coordination
DEA,
office,
they looked like
disguised as an
evidence of a
international
deliberate
education
strategy to
consulting
target new
service,
users.
was raided at
The human
4:33
cost
a.m.
defined
and
Seattle's
found
crisis.
to contain records
Every
linking the
statistic
Indiana
represented
operation to
someone's
recruitment
family,
networks in
someone's
3 foreign
loss.
countries and labor
Parents found their
placement
children
arrangements at
unresponsive
14
in
Midwest
bedrooms.
employers who
Schools
had,
reported
knowingly
students
or
collapsing in
unknowingly,
bathrooms,
participated
and emergency
in the
rooms
scheme. In
faced
St. Louis,
wave
a
after
financial
wave
services
of
office
overdoses
registered to a
linked to
syndicate
counterfeit
ghost
pills.
corporation was
Police
found to
traced many
contain the
of these
physical
deaths
currency
back to a
processing
handful of local
infrastructure
distribution cells dismantled during the operation. Public health data show that
$640,000 in
fentanyl
mixed
has
foreign
now
currency being
surpassed
processed
every
for
other
conversion
cause
alone.
of death for Americans aged 18 to 45,
With records
overtaking
connecting
car
the
accidents,
Louis office to
suicide,
offshore
and gun
accounts in
violence
Cyprus,
combined.
Malta, and Hong Kong.
Seattle, once seen as
Across
distant
9
from border
states, the
smuggling
remaining
routes,
red markers
became the
went
evidence
dark
that
in
the
the pre-dawn
crisis
hours
was
of the
national.
Midwestern autumn
The city's
morning.
overdose surge
When
mirrored
the
the rest of the
5-hour
country's
operational window
trajectory,
closed,
from
the
isolated
preliminary
incidents
numbers were
to
released
systemic
internally
disaster.
to command staff.
Not only seizing drugs, but guns
437
and
confirmed student victims identified and
$650,000.
contacted across
Drugs and
Midwest
guns go
Continental's
together,
enrollment
and this group had
records.
an arsenal
53
at their
locations
disposal.
secured.
The 37
78 individuals
Operation
in federal
Take Back
custody.
America exposed how
47,000
easily
fraudulent
international
immigration
networks
documents
embedded
seized and
themselves
preserved as
inside
evidence.
American cities.
$1.9
By the
million
time the
in
first raid
cash
began,
assets seized from
agents had mapped more
syndicate-controlled
than a
accounts and
dozen
facilities.
interconnected cells between Seattle,
Server
Tacoma, and
infrastructure
smaller
containing
towns
complete
along Puget
operational
Sound.
records for
Each
7
group
years of the
handled a
Global
different
Education
task:
Syndicate's Illinois
manufacturing,
network,
storage, transport,
fully
or street
intact and in
distribution,
federal custody,
making the network
and
harder to dismantle
1,050
completely.
federal agents
ICE officials
standing in the
argued
wreckage
that
of a
city
criminal
governments like
enterprise that
Seattle's
had hidden
had turned a
itself behind the
blind eye
most
to
trusted
repeat
brand in
offenders.
American civil
In their
society.
statement, they accused
The promise
municipal
of
authorities
education.
of releasing known public safety threats into the community.
The exploitation
citing multiple
network had
deported
taken more damage in
cartel-linked
5
suspects
hours
who had
than
returned
in its
to
entire
Washington
7-year
undetected.
operational history.
ICE Director
2
of
weeks
Field
later, in a
Operations
secure
stated
federal
bluntly,
review
if
facility in the
local
Dirksen
governments
Federal
refuse
Building
to
in downtown
cooperate,
Chicago,
we will
the analytical
redirect
team
our
working
assets
through
to
Project
enforce
Paper
the law
Fortress's full
ourselves.
record set was
Public
reading a
safety
second story,
cannot be optional.
not the story of Aldrich
The agency's
Somerton
language
Payne,
made clear this was
not
not
even
a
the story
temporary
of the
campaign.
Global Education
It was a
Syndicate's
shift in
Illinois
national
network.
strategy aimed at dismantling the barriers between federal immigration enforcement and local
The story of who had been paid
Seattle
to
now
protect
finds
it. The
itself
documentation,
on
when it
notice
emerged
for
from the seized
immigration
ledger
enforcement.
records and the digital
ICE
payment
agents will be
logs,
ramping
was
up their
extensive and
operations
precise.
throughout the city, looking
17
to detain
individuals
and
with
deport
active
people
government
here
credentials,
illegally
regulatory
as part of a
authority,
targeted
or law
crackdown.
enforcement
Good evening,
appointments
I'm Molly
appeared in
Shen.
Project
Seattle's
Paper
mayor,
Fortress's
Bruce
payment
Harrell,
records
took the
as
podium the same
recipients of
evening
funds
and
from
called the move
syndicate-controlled
a
accounts.
dangerous form of federal
Payment
overreach.
structured with the same
He
care
invoked the
and
10th
deliberateness
Amendment,
as the Visa
arguing
fraud
that federal
itself,
agents
never
could
large
not
enough in a
compel
single
local
transaction
police
to trigger
assist in
automated reporting
deportations or
thresholds,
detentions.
always routed
Harrell
through
said
at least
Seattle
2
would remain a
intermediary business
sanctuary
accounts,
city,
always
one that
timed to
upholds
coincide with
humanity
periods
and
when
due
Midwest
process
Continental
even under
faced
pressure.
its highest regulatory
His response
exposure.
drew applause from
Among those
immigrant
subsequently
advocacy
charged, a
groups, but opened
senior
the
licensing
floodgates for
examiner within the
confrontation.
Illinois
The
Private
mayor's
Academic
office
Institution
pledged to
Framework,
protect the rights
whose
of
annual
residents
review
regardless
reports
of
on
immigration
Midwest
status.
Continental had,
To
over
ICE,
5 consecutive
that
years,
sounded like
consistently
defiance.
found the
By the
institution in
weekend,
full compliance
downtown
despite
Seattle became
documented
the stage
anomalies
for
in it.
dueling narratives. Protesters filled the streets outside City
Foreign
Hall
enrollment
carrying
figures
signs
that
that
should
read,
have triggered
"Shut
federal
down ICE
referral. A
and
federal
sanctuary
service
for
system
all."
auditor whose
Chants
access
echoed
logs,
through the financial
cross-referenced
district,
with syndicate
while local police
operational
tried to
records,
keep
showed a
demonstrations
pattern
peaceful.
of database
A few
query
blocks away,
activity in the weeks
counter-protesters
preceding each
waved
of the
American
3
flags
federal
and held up
immigration
photos
audits
of
that had
overdose
nominally
victims,
reviewed
demanding
Midwest
stricter
Continental's
immigration
enrollment
laws.
records
The images
activity.
captured the new face of the national divide. One side calling for
Consistent with
compassion,
advanced
the other for
preparation
control.
of records to
Behind
withstand
the headlines,
scrutiny,
the
2 state
operation's
legislators
logistics
whose office
revealed why it
correspondence
required
records
every
recovered
ounce
from a
of that
syndicate
authority.
server showed
The
prior
DEA,
notification
ICE,
of pending
FBI,
state
and
oversight
ATF
inquiries into
operated
private
under a
academic
unified
institution
command structure
practices.
that had been months in the
Notifications
making.
received weeks
Each
before the
agency brought
inquiries
its
were
own
formally
arsenal of
announced,
expertise.
allowing the
DEA led the narcotics tracing,
syndicate
ICE
to manage
managed
their documentary
immigration and
exposure,
logistics data,
and, most
FBI
devastatingly,
handled digital
State
forensics,
Education
and
Commissioner
ATF
Harlan
dealt with
Beecroft
weapons,
Grays himself,
recovery and
whose
explosives.
encrypted communications
Together they
with
formed a
syndicate
command
operational
network capable of
coordinators
responding in real
recovered from
time
the
as
seized
new
physical
intelligence
ledgers
surfaced.
and a personal
The
device
operation's
taken from his
precision bordered
Springfield
on
office
military
on the morning of the
coordination.
raids.
Over 600 agents,
Showed a
officers, and analysts worked
4-year
in
record of
sequence during
active
the
management of the
36-hour
regulatory
window of action.
environment around Midwest
Helicopters
Continental,
hovered over
not
industrial
passive
parks
protection.
in Tacoma.
Active
Drones mapped
management.
warehouses in Arlington, and federal
Grays
strike
had not
teams
merely
breached
looked away.
safe houses across
He had used the
Whidbey
full
Island.
institutional weight
one
of his
raid,
regulatory
agents
authority
discovered
to
grenade
direct oversight
components and
resources
volatile
away from the
chemicals
operation,
stored beside
to
narcotics,
suppress internal
forcing the
flagging
deployment
reports from
of
his own
hazmat
staff,
teams to secure
and
the
to
site.
ensure that Midwest
The
Continental's
operation spanned
licensing
both
remained
urban
intact
and rural
through 3
terrain,
renewal
revealing
cycles
how the
despite
cartel had used
accumulating
Washington's
evidence that should
geography
have
to
triggered its
conceal its
revocation.
trade.
Count indictment
There were
includes
honest
drug
people
dealers
inside
and a
that
truck
regulatory
driver from
system.
Snohomish County, King
Many of
County,
them.
and Mexico. While
Licensing
more than a dozen
examiners
are
who
in
had
custody,
submitted anomaly
6
flags
remain
and
on the
watched them
run,
disappear
and the
into
DEA
administrative
says
review
this
processes that
investigation
never
is
concluded.
ongoing.
ICE
U.S.
agents who had
Attorney's
opened
Office for
preliminary
Western
files
Washington
on
later
Midwest
confirmed it was
Continental's
the
enrollment
largest
patterns
multi-defendant
and been
indictment
told
in
the
2
matter was
decades.
under interagency
37
review
federal counts
indefinitely.
covered
A Department of
conspiracy,
Education regional
distribution,
compliance
weapons
officer
possession,
who had
and
formally
money laundering.
recommended a federal
Investigators
investigation
said the
into
indictments
Midwest
were structured
Continental's
to
SEVIS
prevent plea
records
deals
2
that could
years
collapse
before the
case,
operation was
ensuring
discovered.
that cartel cartel-linked
and had been
suspects
quietly
would face
transferred to
full
a different
federal
portfolio
prosecution.
before her recommendation could
coordination
be acted
between
upon.
agencies
That
was
officer
praised
sat
as
in
a
the
model
review
for
room
future
during the debrief and
anti-cartel
looked at the
missions.
project paper fortress
Federal officials
documentation
credited the
without
success
speaking
to
for a long
advancements
time.
in digital
Then
forensics
said,
and
I
data
reported
fusion.
it. I was
Analysts
moved.
had tracked financial
And
flows
400 more
across
students walked in the
cryptocurrency
front door
exchanges,
after I was
matched
gone.
GPS data from seized phones, and
That
decoded
statement went into the
encrypted
federal
telegram
record.
channels.
The
Every
system had not
suspect was
failed through
identified through a
incompetence.
blend
It
of
had been
digital
managed through
breadcrumbs
corruption.
and
The
traditional
regulatory
surveillance.
framework had
The
not
lesson
been
was clear.
inadequate.
Modern
It had been
cartel
purchased
operations
by
rely
a man
on
who
technology,
understood exactly
and
how
only
it functioned and
technology-driven
had used
enforcement
that
can
understanding
dismantle
to
them.
ensure it would
Yet,
function
as
as a
the headlines
shield
faded,
rather than an
the
oversight
aftermath
mechanism.
became as complex as the operation itself.
There was no second secret
in Washington
police force
and
here.
across the country,
But there was
officials
something
hailed
equally
the Seattle
dangerous,
takedown
a second
as proof
secret
that the
regulatory
cartel threat
apparatus
was not
operating in
limited to the
parallel
border.
with the legitimate
The
one,
message spread
controlled
fast.
entirely
Cartels
by
had
the
already
syndicate and
infiltrated
Commissioner
American
Grays,
cities.
designed to
The United
produce
States was
compliance findings on
finally
demand
back.
and suppress
In political
investigation on
speeches
command.
and campaign ads, One statistic echoed everywhere.
Now, it was
6.9
dismantled,
million
and the
potential
system,
deaths
the
prevented.
real one,
The
one
number
that had been
became
built
both
to protect
evidence
students and
and
not
argument,
exploit them,
a
would
rallying
be
cry
rebuilt
for
from the
stronger
foundation,
enforcement policies.
with the names
will
of
be
everyone who
inspected,
had sold it
which
on
one
record,
will be
in
waved through,
custody, and
and
on their
which
way to a
cameras
federal
are being
courtroom.
watched by people who can be trusted not to
As the
see.
indictments expanded
According to
and the Project
investigators,
Paper Fortress
suspicion first
architecture
grew
became
when
fully
several
mapped in the
cocaine
weeks following the
seizures in
raids,
separate
a picture
jurisdictions
emerged
began
that
showing
extended far
structural
beyond
similarities
Illinois,
that
far
should not
beyond
have
fake
overlapped.
universities,
Different
and
cargo
far beyond the
categories, different shipping
437
routes,
students
different
whose
declared
visa records
origin
had been.
chains. Yet the
Visible
concealment
surface of
methods
this
kept
operation.
rhyming. False industrial
Global Education
casings,
Syndicate's
modified
network
refrigeration
connected to a
compartments,
transnational
cargo
human
layered
smuggling
inside legitimate
infrastructure
marine
documented
supply
across 18
consignments,
countries.
seal irregularities that did not show obvious
Its foreign
tampering
recruitment
until
apparatus,
containers were
the
opened under
consultancy
forensic
fronts in
review.
South Asia,
At first,
West
it looked
Africa,
like a
and Latin
sophisticated
America
trafficking
had over
network
7
exploiting
years
weaknesses
processed
in
over
maritime
2,000
cargo oversight.
individual student
But then
cases.
another pattern emerged.
Not all of them had
Certain
ended up in
shipments seemed to
Illinois.
move too
Syndicate's
cleanly through
placement
sensitive
network extended
checkpoints.
to fake
Some
or
containers
compromised
avoided
educational
secondary screening
institutions
despite
and 4
minor
other US
anomalies that
states,
should have triggered
and to labor
inspection.
exploitation
Others passed through
operations in
during
the
odd
agricultural
staffing
corridors
windows
of the
that
Midwest.
investigators later
The service
found
industry
lined up
supply chains of the
unusually
Great
well
Lakes
with
region,
duty schedules
and to
held by a
logistics
very
and
small group of
warehousing.
officers assigned to security-sensitive roles. That was when federal narcotics teams stopped looking only at the
Networks
traffickers.
of the
They started
Ohio
looking
River
at the
Valley,
gatekeepers,
the routing
and what they
infrastructure
found
showed
was
connections
deeply
between
unsettling.
Global Education
Several officers
Syndicate
assigned to
financial
port
entities
security and
accounts
inspection
linked to
support had
transnational human
unusual
trafficking
communication
networks,
links,
with
burner
operational ties to
contacts,
smuggling
encrypted message
organizations
patterns,
moving migrants
unexplained
through the southern
location
border
overlaps,
corridor,
and in
not a
some
direct
cases financial
organizational
activity that
relationship,
did not remotely
but a
fit
documented
military
financial
pay.
overlap,
Nothing
shared
obvious
money
enough
movement
at first to
infrastructure,
spark a
shared
public
offshore
scandal,
account
but enough to build a
intermediaries, shared
covert
legal
inquiry.
services contractors
Cash deposits
that placed
broken
the
into
Global
smaller
Education
amounts,
Syndicate
payments
in the
routed
same
through
financial
relatives,
ecosystem
vehicle
as
purchases out of
organizations
sync
whose
with
activities
salary,
included the
travel
movement
that
of
did
human
not
beings.
match declared leave plans. One officer had a storage unit paid for in cash. Another
profit,
appeared connected
across
to a marine
international
services
borders,
intermediary
without legal
with no
authorization,
clear
and the
business
final
reason for
document
frequent
recovered from
contact.
Commissioner
A
Grace's
third had
personal
repeated
files,
access logs
a
during
file
cargo
found on a
windows he
personal
was never
encrypted drive
officially
seized
assigned
from
to
his Springfield
supervise.
residence on the
Each
morning of the
detail by
raid
itself could be
revealed what
explained
Project
away.
Paper Fortress
Together they
had
looked like
ultimately been designed
compromise.
to become.
The deeper investigators went, the more disturbing the picture became.
A document
The
labeled
officers were
Phase
not,
3.
according to the working theory, moving cocaine themselves from cartel-controlled boats
A
directly into the
long-form
country.
expansion
Their
blueprint,
role
a
was more
5-year
valuable than
plan
that.
to
They
replicate
were
the
smoothing the
Midwest
pathway.
Continental
They
model
allegedly
across
provided
7
timing,
additional states,
adjusted internal
using
attention,
Grace's national
used official
regulatory
knowledge to
connections
create
to
cleaner
facilitate
transit windows,
expedited
directed
private
scrutiny
academic
away from certain
institution
shipments,
licensing,
and in at
to
least some
install
cases,
syndicate
according to
aligned
seized
licensing
records, may have
examiners
helped
in key state
identify which
oversight
containers
positions,
were
and
safe
2,
to move once they reached the dock.
expand
That
the
is how
foreign
major
recruitment
port
network
smuggling
to a
really
target
works,
intake
not by
1,000
crashing
new
through
students per
security,
year
by bending it
across the
from
expanded
within.
network.
Publicly, the
Not
officers
just
looked like
exploiting the
exactly
education
what they were
system,
supposed to be:
inhabiting it
disciplined, trained,
permanently.
reliable men serving in a security environment most civilians never fully understand.
scale.
They wore the uniform. They understood chain of command.
system had not
They
merely
operated
been
in spaces
infiltrated. It
full
had
of
been
restricted
scheduled for
equipment,
systematic
controlled
occupation
entry points,
by people
cargo
who
monitoring
understood its
systems,
architecture
and maritime
completely
enforcement
and had every
protocols.
intention of
If a
using it as
trafficker
a
had to
vehicle
build
for
an
human
ideal
exploitation
partner for moving
for as long as they
narcotics through
could
a
keep the
hardened port,
oversight
it would be
apparatus
someone
pointed in the
exactly
wrong
like
direction.
that. Someone already inside. Someone trusted. Someone who
The
could make a
realization,
dangerous shipment
documented,
look routine
evidenced,
simply by
filed
knowing
into
where
federal
attention would
court
be
record
and where it
was
would
the one
not.
that kept the
Investigators
investigators
began
working
reconstructing
past
the network
midnight
through
in the
3
weeks after the
parallel
arrests,
tracks:
because
cargo
what they were
data,
looking at was
communication
not simply
data,
a
and
criminal
money.
enterprise
Cargo
that had been
data
stopped.
showed repeated
It was a
movement
blueprint
patterns
that had been
involving
stopped
high-risk
one
concealment
expansion
cargo
cycle
that
before it
kept
became
touching the same
self-sustaining.
ports
The
or
real
inspection
cost of what Aldrich
relationships.
Somerton
Communication
Payne,
data
Harlan Beecroft
suggested
Grays,
covert
and the
coordination,
Global Education
often
Syndicate
indirect,
built
between people
cannot
in
be
maritime
expressed in
logistics and
indictment counts or
individuals
seized
tied to
cash
narcotics
totals.
trafficking networks.
437
Money filled in the
students.
motive. It was
Real
not
people.
enormous at first glance.
Young
That was the
people.
clever part. Large, unexplained riches would have triggered
22-year-old
alarms
engineering
earlier.
graduate from
Instead, the
Hyderabad,
payments
whose
appeared
family had sold
incremental,
land to pay
spread
his
out,
enrollment fees,
layered through
who
side
had arrived in
businesses,
Chicago believing he was
consulting
beginning a
payments,
master's
marine
degree,
repair
and had instead
invoices,
been placed in
family
a warehouse
accounts,
in
and
Rockford
cash-heavy
under threat of
transfers
deportation
designed
if
to
he
look
refused.
almost
A 25-year-old
forgettable.
woman
But
from
corruption
Lagos
does
who
not
had
need
told her
giant
parents she
piles
was
of visible money to destroy a system. It only needs enough to make betrayal worth the risk. And according to investigators, that is exactly what had happened. One of the key breaks came from a shipment that should have failed cleanly, but loan might have been dismissed as human error. But the same shipment path also intersected with an officer whose duty access logs, phone location data, and off-duty contacts now looked highly suspicious. Once that officer's circle was examined, other names began surfacing. Then came the internal records, duty rosters, private notes, unofficial shift swaps, container numbers copied down outside normal reporting channels, port lane references written in shorthand. Enough to suggest that the smugglers were not relying on luck. They were relying on information from inside the security architecture. That revelation transformed the case, because cocaine moving through a U.S. port is one problem. Cocaine moving through a U.S. port with help from active duty officers is another level entirely. That is no longer just narcotics trafficking. It is institutional compromise, and compromise at a port does not remain limited to one drug load for long. Once traffickers know they have reliable access inside a protected system, the temptation grows. More shipments, higher value cargo, riskier concealment, bolder scheduling, wider networks. Eventually, the port itself begins to change. Workers start sensing certain containers are untouchable. Honest personnel learn which questions create tension. Small favors become normal. Silent personnel knew something was wrong. How many traffickers had built their schedules around military reliability? That was the part that made the case nationally explosive. Uniformed service carries an assumption of integrity. Ports rely on trust at every level. Trust that inspections are real, trust that clearances mean something, trust that personnel assigned to protect strategic infrastructure are not secretly using their access to help criminal organizations move poison into the country. Once that trust cracks, everything becomes suspect. Every waived container, every unusual shift change, every missing camera segment, every cargo hold that somehow avoided a deeper look. For honest officers, the betrayal cut deepest there. They signed up to defend borders, waters, and critical infrastructure. To discover that some of their own may have turned that mission into a paycheck for smugglers was more than embarrassing. It was corrosive. It made every hard-earned success look fragile. Every honest inspection feel devalued. Every badge in the unit carried the shadow of men who sold theirs. And the traffickers knew exactly why that mattered. Cartels and cocaine pipelines do not just buy routes, they buy credibility, they buy delay, they buy controlled silence, and nothing is more valuable than a protected shipment moving under the invisible shield of people nobody expects to question. By afternoon, federal teams were already working to map how far the conspiracy stretched. Were the officers paid directly by cartel-linked intermediaries? Were port civilians involved? Were trucking coordinators, customs facilitators, and warehouse handlers also part of the chain? Had multiple U.S. ports been touched? Or was this operation concentrated through a single strategic harbor where the compromised officers could reliably shape outcomes? Those answers would determine whether this was a shocking local corruption case or something far more dangerous, a standing narcotics corridor hidden inside national port security. As the evidence continued piling up, one truth became impossible to ignore. This scheme did not depend on brute violence. It depended on the appearance of order. That was why it lasted. The cocaine was hidden inside the ordinary flow of maritime commerce. Steel boxes, manifests, marine parts, food shipments, industrial